Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a seminar on Can More Data Reduce Poverty? My name is Johanna Köhler, and I work in the water program in the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. And I have the great pleasure of chairing the session today. It's a bit over 2 years that this hand pump went out in the car park just outside the School of Geography and the Environment. And almost, two years exactly on this day, we had a seminar sort of outlining some of the work and research that was planned and is going on. And now, over these 2 years, a lot of data has been collected at the hand pump out there, but also at a lot of hand pumps in Kenya and in Bangladesh. And this has led to some advancements on the technical side in terms of monitoring the performance of hand pumps and then predicting some of the performance of the hand pumps. On the institutional side, in terms of improved maintenance for broken hand pumps and 2 companies being set up in Kenya. And on the financial side, with a Water Services Maintenance Trust Fund being set up in Kenya that monitors the performance of those companies and provides financial support. Today we'll hear a bit more about the implications and impact of such data for the rural water users, for the water sector more generally, and for poverty reduction. And this work has gained quite a bit of traction over these years as well, being cited on BBC, in The Economist, and on ITV. And we're very delighted that very recently in July, the Smart Hand Pumps work has also won the inaugural Vice Chancellor's Innovation Award, both for the building capacity and the overall categories. We have quite a sort of tight program today, so we'll try to move through swiftly. And just to give you a quick outline of what's about to happen. First, Professor David Clifton will provide some insights on the hype, hope, and reality of AI and the data side. Then Heloise Greeff will take over to talk about using AI for making water supply more reliable. Then Patrick Thomson will talk about do people actually use these hand pumps? And Professor Rob Hope will close on leading a bit more to this question, and can more data reduce poverty? And then we're very delighted that Tom Wildman from Oxfam TB has joined us today to reflect on what's been said and to bring in his wider expertise on market-based solutions or approaches to water and sanitation. And then we'll have some scope on time for Q&A, and we can take it into a more informal discussion over drinks as well. So now I would like to introduce David Clifton. He's an associate professor at the Department of Engineering Science. He leads the computational health informatics lab there, and it's up at IBME, the Institute of Biomedical Engineering. And he'll tell us a bit more about big data and what they do with them, from jet engines to the hand pump. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. A very quick show of hands. Do we have any AI people in the audience? Machine learning, statistics, related disciplines. Fantastic. Okay. So that's good. Oxford is a great place for AI, I have to say. Primarily because of projects as the one we're going to present to you today. So it's a fantastic environment where you get people who have deep expertise in particular places. So for example, this very wide-ranging project funded by a whole bunch of research councils and government departments is aiming to make a huge difference, non-academic huge difference. So trying to lift millions of people out of poverty and out of water insecurity. And there's a real advantage to an environment like Oxford for that, because you've got obviously the developmental experts and the economists and so forth who know this area backwards, but also we're able to rub shoulders with engineers, computer scientists, statisticians, people who care about AI. So there's a lot of hype about AI, and our university is pretty good at stoking that hype, it must be said, particularly if you go to, for example, the University of Bedford. There's quite a lot about AI, but there is some substance behind the hype, and I think Oxford's got a very good track record in projects like this where we can actually make a difference. That's the goal. So it's not just guys in basements tonking around with computers and a bit of data, publishing papers every now and again. Although we do like our basements, we do like our data. We like to engage in real problems and talk to the people that matter in these particular fields. So the AI part of this very large and complex project had its genesis, excuse me, as just mentioned, in jet engines. So you're probably thinking, what's the commonality between jet engines and hand pumps? A jet engine has got lots of vibrometers on it, things that measure vibration. If you've played your Nintendo Wii Fit, you know it's got a vibrometer in there. It's measuring gyroscopic angle and things like that. So we can get all of these data from your phone, from your Nintendo Wii. You can get them from jet engines as well. So if you've flown on the Airbus A380 or the Boeing 787 or the Eurofighter Typhoon, then the jet engines are monitored by those kind of technologies that came out of our lab. As mentioned, and you probably got a clue from the Institute of Biomedical Engineering where I'm based, the name of it, we've translated that into healthcare. So we do human health monitoring as well as the monitoring of jet engines, which is more or less the same kind of thing. Collect data from sensors and try and track the health of the thing that you care about. In that case, it would be a patient in hospital. And again, can we make a real difference? We can get FDA approval for these things and put them into hospitals. So if any of you have the misfortune to go into, for example, the Oxford University hospitals, you'll be tracked by our systems in there. They're used as standard across the Oxford University hospitals. And this is the latest and probably greatest of those projects, as we'll introduce to you today. So I won't steal the thunder of the scientists and the developmentalists who are coming up, but hopefully you've gained a bird's eye view about where these things came from and where we're going. Thanks very much. So allow me to hand over to Heloise, our superstar scientist, who's been doing tons of the work to get this in, and also flying to Kenya quite a lot as well. Thank you, Heloise.
Thank you, David. Hi everyone, welcome for coming. As David just mentioned, that's all your speakers today. As David just mentioned, we don't just like to sit in the basement. He sends me to Kenya quite a lot, and I end up under a tree like this, having to observe the hand pump and how the people and the animals interact with it. So to many of you, a hand pump like this might seem like an outdated piece of technology, but in reality, there is still more than 1 million of them across sub-Saharan Africa, and they're being used by 200 million people every day to meet their daily water needs. And unfortunately, about a third of them are broken at any given time, so people are left to use other water sources to meet their daily needs. So David spoke about a patient, a Boeing, and a hand pump. You all might still not be sure how this comes together. Well, it turns out if you put a sensor on any one of them, you can collect something which looks a bit like a heart rate. Of course, in the patient, it is an actual heart rate. Maybe I just sat under that tree for too long, but the hand pump one does look a bit like a heart rate to me. So this is the actual data that we're collecting from the hand pumps by putting one of these sensors onto them. And we then use machine learning to process this data to find small changes in the vibrations of the hand pump to try and predict when it is going to break. The difference between a Boeing aircraft engine and a patient in a hospital is that out in the field, we don't actually have access to electricity, so we're immediately limited by the amount of power we can use with the machine learning. We also don't have Wi-Fi, so we have a limited bandwidth through which we can send this data, which means that we have to do some amount of processing on the hand pump before we send that to the cloud. And this is the novel part of our monitoring system, is that we can push some of the processing to the hand pump to happen out in the field, and then send small packets of data back to the cloud where we can do further machine learning. So what actually happens on the hand pump? What actually happens in a sensor like this? Well, firstly, we collect the raw waveforms, which one of these sensors has an accelerometer in it, which all of us have in our smartphones or our smartwatches nowadays. And it collects three orthogonal axes, the gravitational force of the hand pump handle being moved up and down. We then pre-process the data, which is a common step in any data analysis where you prepare the data so that you can do some sort of analysis on it. For us, we look at the frequencies at which the hand pump vibrates. So that is what the data that we collect. And then secondly, a very common machine learning's next step is we do feature extraction. So we extract the features that we typically think will be most tell us the most about the changes happening in the hand pump. And then finally we classify it. We say whether it's normal or abnormal. We basically give it a score between 0 and 1. So as someone is pumping, the processor inside is doing all of this, and every couple of seconds it puts out a number between 0 and 1, where 1 is that the hand pump is functional and 0 is where the hand pump is not breaking, or is breaking. So how well is it actually at telling if it's unwell or if it's working? Well, by just using the sensor, we can accurately pick up about 2/3 of the failures on the hand pumps. And here you can see there's a very distinct difference between a working and a non-working hand pump. So that's actually what we're picking up. And then we send the score to the cloud, where we can then apply excuse me. We can then apply more advanced machine learning techniques to further process those scores to increase the fidelity of our guess about what the hand pump condition is. And this is important because there is an actual cost associated with sending someone out to the hand pump to fix it or to replace the battery once it's been depleted. So by further processing it on the cloud, we're able to reduce the amount of data that we require from the hand pump. And this is important because for a frequently used hand pump, we collect about 1 GB of data per month per hand pump. So over a vast network, it's not possible to transmit and save all of that data. So by doing some of the processing on the hand pump, we can reduce the amount of data we require without sacrificing the score of our guess, whether the hand pump is functioning or not functioning. So what does this actually mean for the person who arrives at the hand pump? There's a lot of hype around AI, there's a lot of hype around tech for impact. Well, combined with a proper maintenance service, we're able to reduce or even eliminate the downtime in the hand pump. So as part of the pilot, pre-pilot, hand pumps were typically broken for up to 27 days, and afterwards that could be reduced to 48 hours. And as we continue to increase our work by becoming more accurate in predicting whether the hand pump will break, the idea is to actually perform preventive maintenance, where this hand pump can become a reliable water source for the people who rely on it. And I'm handing over to Patrick Thomson now, who will talk more about whether people use the hand pumps and how they use it.
Hi, thank you everybody. Thank you, Heloise, for introducing me. So we're now, from the AI, we're sort of winding back a bit further to sort of some of the more basic questions about hand pump use. So back when we first started the project, as Heloise implied, the idea was, can we use these data that are coming from the pumps to send mechanics to fix them? And we're getting to the point of being able to do predictive maintenance, but the initial question was, can we just see when a pump is broken and get a mechanic out there within a day or so to fix the pump? Because one of the problems that we found in the areas where these pumps were being used was that a pump would break and would not be fixed for days or weeks or even months. And this has all sorts of impacts in terms of health and livelihoods. So these are the sort of bits of basic information about groundwater, why this matters. Groundwater, all other things being equal, which is a very large caveat, is generally a much, much better source of drinking water for rural communities than, say, surface water from rivers or streams. Water from rivers or streams, in many, many cases, will be polluted and therefore will cause illness. In dry places, also, groundwater is the only source of water in certain times of the year. So, you can just see from that picture, which is in eastern Kenya, that's a very dry area. So, the nearest river to that pump was probably a couple of kilometres, and that was dry about 9 months of the year. So these water sources are essential. So we were aiming to fix pumps, and as you can hopefully see from this point to work. Okay, I will point here. As you can see from this thing down here, this shows the usage of the pump for every day. So we were measuring the pump usage, translating that into the number of litres to see how much water people were using, and we were logging that every hour. So that's a day, and then 2 days, drops right down. That's when the pump broke. We saw that, we dispatched a mechanic, and then the pump was working again on the 12th, and back up and working again. And there's very interesting data that can be worked out from these usage levels. So one thing, as I said here, there's very limited real empirical data on pump use. Often people work out how much pumps they're using by looking at the population using them and multiplying it by a certain number of litres per person and using that as an estimate. Whereas what we found was that pumps in the same area, the usage between them was varied hugely, orders of magnitude. So there were some pumps that for one time in the dry season were being used 24 hours a day for a period of about 2 or 3 weeks. 24 hours a day, and that was because cattle were using the pumps, well, not the cattle themselves, although there is a YouTube clip of a cow pumping a pump, which you can look up. People were pumping the water for cattle during the night and for people during the day. So there wasn't very much data about it. And also, so we ourselves were very surprised by the data that we got, that it was such a huge range. So this really showed that some of the assumptions about infrastructure that's installed in these rural areas, some of the assumptions about if we install a pump which has good water because it's groundwater, etc., we will get these, say, health impacts. There are a whole set of assumptions that are implicit in we're going to install a pump because it's good for people. And these data, even before we get to the AI, starts to help us really get a much more nuanced picture on this. And for those who are interested, there's an issue with the JMP is the Joint Monitoring Project. Sorry, I realised I stuck an acronym there without thinking about it. So that's, in a very broad sense, that's what we started off doing. Trying to make repairs more quickly, which we succeeded in doing. We reduced downtimes in the area we were working from around about a month to 2 or 3 days, and also this extra nuanced understanding of how do people actually use pumps. So one thing that came out of that was illustrated here on this next slide. So those of you who know Kenya, there's long range and short range. This is from Kenya. From the top coming down, we've got rainfall, which is sort of intuitive, how it's coming from the sky, in blue. And in black is the average pump use across our study site. So as you can see from here, around about April, May, it starts to rain quite a lot. Very little rain in January, February. So that, can you see the rainfall pattern? So there's a lot of variation, but you can see there's a huge drop when the rains sort of kick off around about sort of April, and the rains were all quite late that year actually. Often they do tend to start a bit earlier. So that was very, very dry for the first 2 months of the year. Then the rains kicked off and the general pump use dropped massively. And this is intuitive. There's more other water, people use pumps less. But actually being able to measure pump by pump, even though this is an average, what that reduction is was very interesting, because in different areas the drop was a lot, 80%. In other areas it was much less. So overall for the study site there was a 40% drop in pump use between dry season to wet season. Also, the beady-eyed of you, hopefully, will have spotted where you have really big blue spikes coming down from above. If you follow them down, you see a spike downwards in the black line as well. So what that was telling us, and that was new, that was something that we hadn't expected or read about anywhere else, that was showing us that immediately after heavy rainfall, people stop using the pump, and they stop using the pump a lot. I mean, you can see if we look at, I apologise there's no pointer, but if you look at right on the right hand side of the graph, that's the 1st of December, really big rate, 100 millimetres approximately, and the usage over the whole study site dropped by about 3/4 on that day. So that's telling us that immediately after the rainfall, people stop using the pump, and after 2 or 3 days it goes back up again to the previous level. So again, it's intuitive. There's other sources. There's rainwater harvesting, but some forms of rainwater harvesting are not going to give very good quality water from a health point of view. So again, this is back to the question. There may well have been a functioning hand pump that people could use, but people were choosing not to. So again, the assumptions we make about why we're installing a hand pump or any other sort of infrastructure, we can start to interrogate those and really examine, how much they hold up and whether effectively, the assumptions that we are using to do these things, which cost money and are actually valid or not, or whether we need to rethink things. So this is essentially the detail of what I said just on the previous slide about the 1st of December, which is relatively self-explanatory. It's just a box plot, and you can see the day it rained, which was the 1st of December. Immediately after, dropped right down, and then crept back up again within 2 or 3 days. So why does this matter? And I've sort of already said most of this stuff. But one of the key things is really the last 2 points, because one of the huge implicit assumptions about why we do some of these things is because there will be health benefits from it. But if people are not actually using the drinking water that we have worked out is healthy to use, then they may not accrue all those health benefits. And this leads to ask serious questions about if we are going to meet the SDG number 6, which some of you will be familiar with, and if you're not, if you're on the MSc, you will be very familiar with it within 6 months' time, I assure you. A hand pump is actually the right way to go. I mean, I love hand pumps. I've been working on them for the last how many years of my life. But some of this brings up the question is, in the medium to long term, are hand pumps really the way forward? And I'm going to leave that as a question because A, I don't know the answer, and B, it's time to hand over to Rob, who is going to talk, again, moving further out, about data and poverty more generally. So, thank you. You're Rob.
Thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to wrap up now just on the sort of poverty implications of the work. So one of the ways, there's different ways that you can break down and think about poverty. So our colleagues over in OFI look at multidimensional indexes, so where they sort of look at different aspects of health or education and assets and create an index. Others look at income or expenditure, and then increasingly people are looking at subjective welfare. And the way in which a lot of research has evolved is to look at how this welfare or poverty changes over time. So this is some work by David Hume and his colleagues, sort of trying to understand a sort of notional poverty line or welfare line, and whether people are above or below that. Can we have some understanding of who they are and how they behave over time? So we've taken some of this approach in one of our study sites, which is in coastal Kenya. So this is a graphic of it developed by Jacob Katuva, part of his DPhil research. And this uses panel data from 2014, 2015, and 2016 at the household level of 3,500 households to try and understand where households are improving or decreasing in welfare. Blue is good, red is bad. And you can see there's some variation over time that we're picking up here, which I will come back to. It's a very pretty graphic of that. So what Jacob's been trying to look at then, in blue is this sort of welfare index, and in red there's a subjective assessment. So do you feel well off or better off? And is that an appropriate measure of welfare and well-being? And what we're seeing sort of looking at these transitions from people who are never poor in these 3 periods, or are churning from sort of being from poor to non-poor or non-poor to poor, or always poor, is that the index tends to potentially overestimate the never poor, and the subjective tends to overestimate the always poor. So you see a big, sort of quite a neat relationship between the two, with no clear understanding which one is the more accurate. Are people overestimating their poverty or their welfare, trying to look for help or assistance, or is the index being too critical of the positions they're in? And this is important for us, and then trying to then model what would actually improve welfare. So the poverty side, what would actually help improve welfare for these people going forward? And I'll focus just on some of the results from using the welfare index as the dependent variable and modeling it against dependent variables that you can see here. And what we see is there's 4 domains that seem to be quite critical for people to improve their welfare. These are energy supply. So if people have access to solar or grid electricity, that's a positive impact in terms of improving welfare. Education, particularly secondary education, seems to be important. And then to a lesser degree, their drinking water supply, whether it's piped or the reliability of that, seem important. And then a major negative implication is open defecation. So this is quite high in these areas. It was around 50% when we started running our surveys, and it's now around a third. So there's been improvement, but there's a recognition that this creates problems. So those are the four domains where we sort of see policy could engage in this space and potentially improve welfare and poverty outcomes. Wider work that came out of Tim Foster's work that was looking at then sort of payment behaviours. So if we think drinking water would be a net benefit to society, how can we understand people's valuation of an improved water service? So what Tim's work was looking at, he managed to find here, this is one of his research assistants, Taruki. He found communities that had payment records going back from 2 to 26 years. And he very scrupulously jotted down all of this data. So there were 100 communities with 226 years worth of data, 50,000 payment records, to try and model what actually leads to better payment behaviours here. And those predictors are up there in terms of distance to water point, the water quality. So making sure that it's a reasonable thing. Again, it's relatively intuitive. Productive uses, Patrick's already mentioned that sort of livestock are quite important in these areas. And then the seasonality point comes through again. And this figure here models again rainfall going from the top to the bottom, but also in terms of revenue collection over time. When it rains more, people pay less. So you sort of see a climate signal coming through here as well. And the implications as we go forward with climate variability, climate extremes, all the things we're reading with the new IPCC report. If we are seeing extended duration of dry spells, this will have implications for the type of water infrastructure and the provision in these types of communities, but also the finance behind this as well. Will people be paying for this water going forward? So the final piece of work, and I will conclude quickly, is that we incubated 2 companies in Kenya using the idea of the Fundifix model. And as Patrick has mentioned, they are social enterprises. They guarantee a reliable service for the communities to pay. And that has evolved in 2 study sites with now we have about 70,000 people engaged in these systems, both in pipe systems but also in hand pumps. The phase of work that we're now exploring, and I think Tom's going to talk to a little bit as well, is trying to understand how we finance these things going forward. And this is the data part. This gets back to what Heloise and David have been talking about in terms of understanding how people use these hand pumps or pipe systems and how we can create a different financial model. Because if you believe the global estimates, we need $114 billion a year to meet SDG 6.1, and there's just not that amount of money available. So how are we going to find new financial sources for that? So our perspective, very much a simplification, is user tariffs will pay some of these, but it won't be sufficient for full cost recovery. Government have responsibilities, but tend to be quite slow. So we've been trying to look at investors to come in to be catalytic, to try and drive a more holistic and sustainable approach. And this has been through setting up trust funds that try and pick up the gap in the financial provision, looking at both social impacts and also economic impacts. So if people are benefiting from this, and this is the key aspect of the data that we've been talking about, can you have performance-based contracts that you're guaranteeing people maintenance as an asset class? So if you can say to people, you will guarantee X million of people reliable water every day until 2030 in communities and schools, are there investors who are willing to invest in that space? And the current answer is it's an open question. We have mining companies and agricultural companies that have invested in this fund, and there are other people interested in that. But what is critical from my perspective are the type of data that Patrick and Heloise have spoken about that gives a verification, a third-party verification, to provide these social and economic impacts, because the financial case in rural water systems is very nebulous. So I'm going to conclude there. We have a whole flotilla of people who've supported this project over many years, with, I think, thanks in particular to Difford, who started us out 8 years ago, with a very small grant, and then others, the research councils, UNICEF, and many other organisations who've been involved in the work since then. At this point, maybe I'll hand over to Tom as our discussant, and you can lead us on from here, Tom.
Okay, thanks. Hi everyone. So I don't really have a presentation point to, so I'm just going to speak really briefly about the work that Oxfam does in the water space in very similar contexts, and a few questions I have sort of for the presenters based on what we've seen in the field. So Oxfam, I think over the last kind of decade, we've transitioned from the sort of traditional type of charity work of kind of going in and building infrastructure and building water systems, and really looking at how we can use our grant financing to really support sustainable access, much like the team's looking at here. And we really look at kind of 3 pillars on that. So we look at financial viability of systems. Costs money to run these systems, and you got to cover those costs somehow. We look at technical efficiency of the systems, how we can reduce running costs and reduce capital expenditure. And good governance, which is really difficult to define sometimes, but extremely critical. In a lot of these places that you're talking about here, things like transparency on revenue collection, it's very tricky, it's very murky. Things like getting a receipt for the water that you pay for is nearly impossible. And without those good governance systems in place, these systems really fall on their face quite quickly. We work in kind of similar areas within Kenya, in arid and semi-arid lands, and a lot of our work is through kind of county water service providers. So these are essentially government utilities at the county level, and we do co-investments with them. So they kind of put up 50% of costs, and we put up 50%. We've helped them transition to solar-powered pumping systems in several places. We've helped them put in automated payment systems for increased transparency, transition to e-billing systems, which is more efficient for them to do revenue collection, but it's much more transparent also. Now, we've had success in this in kind of urban and peri-urban areas where they do direct management. There's a greater density of people, mostly because they increase their revenue generation. So it's beneficial for them. And it's beneficial to keep those systems running and maintained because it increases their revenue. I don't think we've had success in the more kind of far-flung remote areas. We've collected a lot of data on kind of cost recovery, what it costs to run these systems, etc. And in an urban area, peri-urban area, you can cover at least your operational expenditure. The remote areas, you're pumping from a big depth, high running costs, you're only selling 10 cubic meters of water per day. Even if you minimize non-revenue water, even if you collect tariffs from the majority of the population, you will never be in the black. You will never even cover your OPEX, right? And the fact of the matter is, like Rob said, no one wants to invest in these places that don't give you some kind of a financial return. That's what we're really struggling with, is how do we do that? So we've been working with social finance. They're sort of known for creating the first social impact bond. They helped us take a deep dive in Kenya looking at how we could structure results-based financing to try to incentivize investment in the last mile, essentially, right? How do you incentivize people to invest in water systems with a negative financial return? So we're sort of toying with the idea of an outcomes fund, where an outcomes funder would actually pay financial incentives for things like sustainability, having a pro-poor tariff in place for the poorest, having an O&M model in place like this. There would be financial incentives for those kind of outcomes. So we're hoping to take that forward in Turkana County. Nepal, we also look a lot at sustainability of water systems. In Nepal, something like 75% of water systems are non-functional or in a poor state of functionality at any given time. I think my key message there is it's taken us 2 years to actually take a deep dive to figure out what works and why, and what doesn't work and why not. There was a lot of people ranting about how water user committees and kind of voluntary management doesn't work, and how cost recovery wasn't in place, but no one really knew how much it costs to run and maintain a system, or why people pay for water in some places and why they didn't in others. So I find that in the NGO sector, we spend a lot of time brainstorming the solution, but never brainstorming the actual problem. So I think that what you did here, taking the real deep dive for many years to actually collect that data, is extremely valuable. In our sector, it's very hard to find money for that, to just play around for a while and figure stuff out. I think generally the kind of questions, I kind of try to think of some clever, provocative questions for the presenters here. I mean, and thinking back to the big question of, can data reduce poverty? I mean, I'm a bit upset with Patrick because he kind of stole one of my questions. And it's, I guess, what's your ultimate vision here? Is it to have every hand pump in the world, outfitted with a sensor that gives you binary data, right? And what would that cost compared to just trying to upgrade people to maybe a better level of service? And what I mean is, I was in Denmark at the Greeff pump factory in August. So Greeff is a Danish company that's the world's largest pump manufacturer. And what they say now is they feel that their solar-powered submersible pumps are financially competitive with hand pumps. They brought them down in price. If you're only pumping from kind of 25, 30 meter head, and you want to do kind of 1 to 2 cubic meters per hour, they believe that they can compete now. It's a higher level of service. They break down a lot less. You can throw on some more solar panels to actually generate revenue doing other things, right? So you can add value actually to your water provision financially. So would that be a better use of investment rather than getting binary use data? I don't know. Maybe. What's more important, knowing if people use the pump and if they're using it in the rainy season or not, which wasn't a surprise to me at all actually, or understanding why people didn't make a phone call to get a pump repaired when it broke down. So more kind of the qualitative rather than the quantitative, which is a lot of what we really try to unpack. Yeah, I think that those are my main questions. Thanks.